Welcome to Medicine Redefined, a podcast focusing on helping you reclaim ownership of your health. I'm Dr. Darsha.
And I'm Dr. Altamash Raja. We're your hosts, here to challenge conventional practices and uncover the stories behind pioneers shaping the future of medicine.
Our conversations not only focus on the individual level to dissect common practices for health optimization, but also zoom out to enhance systemic change.
Join us as we look to break the status quo, move the needle forward, and put the health back in healthcare. Jimmy Turner, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks so much for having me. Super excited to be here.
Likewise, man. It's been a long time coming. We've been trying to connect, I guess, for over a year. And so I'm grateful for you to be here. There are so many different questions I want to ask you. I think you're maybe about 5 years ahead of me. And so from a selfish standpoint, how to be a good early career academic physician, I might ask some questions about that. And we can go multiple ways, right? We could talk about philosophy. We could talk about finance. You're really wear multiple hats. I guess I'll start by giving the listener a little bit of insight into your background. You host 2 podcasts. You work technically full time, right? You're 0.96 or something like that.
Yeah, I'm. It's varied over the years, and so at this point, I am like 0.75 clinically.
Got it.
So working 2 days a week most weeks.
You are in program leadership again, and so you're just doing all these things, and you're doing an exceptional job at it. And I guess it's important for people to get an insight of like what is the makeup of somebody like that. And so talk a little bit about your background, and then where the passion for finance and coaching comes in, and maybe even why academic medicine.
Yeah, so I guess to just kind of flesh that out, right? So academic anesthesiologist, did med school residency fellowship all at the same institution, and then stayed on faculty at Wake. So I'm a big Wake Forest fan, which I don't know exactly when this episode is going to come out, but is a very painful time as a basketball fan. So academic anesthesia, and basically my story into the personal finance space. I have to go back to my 4th year of medical school. And so, long story short, some listeners have probably heard my story, but in case you haven't, we had our first kid. She's now turning 13, which is insane. We had kids pretty young. And when we did that, Kristen and I, we felt like the responsible adult-like thing to do is to get term life insurance so that, if one of us died, the other person would be taken care of. Now, mind you, at this time, I literally know nothing about personal finance. I know that my family went through bankruptcy when I was 10 because my parents, they lost their jobs. We racked up 6 figures in credit card debt. So not a lot of financial literacy in my household growing up. And so at the time, we're getting term life insurance. Someone told me I need to do that. I approached the brother of one of my medical school classmates, and someone that I could trust, and said, yeah, sure, we can get you term life insurance, but we should also probably get you disability insurance. I didn't know at the time, I was like, I don't have an income. I don't really understand the need for me to get this. Said no a few times, ended up getting talked into it. I have I have an essential tremor that I take propranolol for. And so I ended up getting denied. It didn't seem like, to be honest with you, like a huge deal at the time, except for when you get to training, there's something at many institutions, most at this point, called the guaranteed standard issue policy, where they don't look into your medical history. They don't look into your background. The only 2 stipulations for a lot of those policies is that you can't have been disabled and you can't have been denied. And so since I had an insurance agent try to make commission off of me, selling me a product I didn't need as a 4th year medical student, to this day, I can't get disability insurance because I got denied and then the GSI was no longer available to me. And so in a lot of ways, I started with a mistrust for the financial industry. And so started learning about stuff as a fellow 5-6 years later. And as I did that, I'm an educator. I love teaching people. And so my residents, my students, my colleagues started coming up and saying, hey, I've got questions about X, Y, and Z. That led to the physician philosopher and Money Meets Medicine, and just, saw a burgeoning need to marry personal finance to burnout. So, very much have always been in that kind of financial wellness space long before that was a cool thing to do 7 years ago. And so, that's kind of my origin story into personal finance. And then now my North Star, my mission is always, doing what's best for people. And so, we continue that at Money Meets Medicine. And actually now we offer own occupation disability insurance so that what happened to me literally doesn't happen to anybody else. And so that's the personal finance journey. But as you mentioned, I've been a coach. I've made courses. I've, done online entrepreneurship for 7 years now in a variety of capacities. So wear lots of hats.
Yeah, that really sucks, man. And that happened to my co-chief, fourth year,
Oh,
as he was going, and he worked with a company, which, and I'll blast him at the time, Pattern. At the time, they were doing good work, and they were referred by somebody we both know and trust. And then, he had an episode where he had maybe a syncopal episode at somewhere in medical school, and no cardiac history, nothing like that, and he got rejected. Now, luckily, in training at Hopkins, for some reason, GSI was still available to him, so he had that to fall back on. So that's interesting. So that worked out well for him in that regard. But yeah, it's ridiculous for
yeah.
people to do that.
I'll follow up on that. And, as I mentioned before the show, I'm a super transparent person. So, there are players in this space that, like the one that you mentioned, that give very, very little time to the consult process. And so they don't really dig into your medical history. They don't really tell you like, hey, if you don't disclose this information, the insurance company is going to find it and they're going to deny you. And so there's not really that deep dive. It's kind of a volume process where they kind of pump people in, pump people out, knowing that, they're going to have a 20% or something denial rate. So what happened to me is going to happen to 20% of people. And it's really tough, right? Because a lot of the well-known people in this space have a list of, disability insurance agents that they recommend. They are ordered in which that person gets paid and not in the order in which, the best agents at the top. And so because of that, this space is rife with conflicts of interest. And there's this big problem of like, who do I trust? Right. Because if you and I went out to dinner, right, and you said, hey, who's the insurance agent that you recommend? I'm not going to be like, hey, here's a list of 10 people. Well, go choose somebody. I'm gonna be like, well, I've worked with, a couple of people, and these are the people that I definitely recommend that you consider. They're going to take their time. They're going to take a deep dive into your history, do the right thing for you, get you the GSI if there's any concern, right? And so I got so sick of seeing that in this space that we created our own disability insurance company so that doesn't happen. And I've actually emailed people about specific companies expressing those concerns, having heard from a lot of people in my audience, hey, I went with X, Y, and Z from this recommended list. I got denied, right? And I heard your story and I was like, oh man, that's what happened to me, right? And I hated hearing those stories. And so, yeah, it's really important. And unfortunately, finding somebody you can trust is challenging.
Yeah. We haven't done a deep dive into asset protection, something we certainly plan on doing. My guy is Larry Keller, even though I don't directly work with him. You probably know him.
I love Larry.
So Larry's fantastic. The way that Larry and I got connected is initially I was going to work with him because I had vetted a bunch of people from White Coat Investor, and we had a great conversation. I also have ITP, and so Larry was like, okay. And a lot of times people don't understand is these people who have relationships with these insurance or the underwriters, they can kind of reach out and not disclose any personal information and say, hey, is this going to be a problem? Is it not going to be a problem? He did that for me. And one of the most amazing things Larry did at the time is, I'm going into my intern year getting this. And Larry said, okay, well, you're going to be in PA for your intern year, but then you're going down to Hopkins. And I know a guy down there and they have a GSI policy. So why don't you just wait down there? And so he referred that business out. Now, he understands this because I've come back and I think I've referred about 9 people, including my wife, to him. And he's written 9 policies for the people that I know. Right. And so there are some people who make good decisions like that. And they'll say, this is 100%. You're not working for me. This is best for you though.
Yeah, 100%. So Larry actually, I'm happy to give as much airtime to Larry as possible. So Larry actually, back when we were originally creating it, helped us set up our process. We used the same general agents as Larry. Phenomenal guy. Couldn't get better service going to Larry by any stretch of the imagination. And back before we started our own process that, I'll be honest with you, Larry encouraged us to do, I sent everybody to Larry too. So anybody that's listening, by all means, he's a fantastic guy. One of the very few people in this space you can actually trust.
Just got to get him to come on the podcast, Larry.
Yeah. Well, it's a tougher space, right? Because so since I'm an anesthesiologist, I can kind of say whatever I want, and like I'm not captive to a company. And so sometimes the conflicts of interest and disclosure in that space are a little different for people. That's what they do. But again, couldn't recommend Larry more highly for sure.
Yeah. So let's shift a little bit. Let's talk about something because you mentioned kind of your North Star about burnout and helping physicians find their purpose, so to speak, right? And I want to talk about a concept that you've given a lot of airtime to, maybe one of your most popular episodes, the arrival fallacy. I remember you a while back posted on Twitter about this and just the way that you who wrote about this were so eloquent, and it made me think about this. Again, 2022 is when I became an attending, and so that light at the end of the tunnel was there for me. And I quickly realized that that's maybe not the case. And I work a lot with residents now, medical students, and we all have this mentality that I just got to get over through 1, 2, 3, 4 hurdle at the end of, anywhere from 8, 9, 10, 11, depending on what fellowship you end up doing or residency you do. You're going to get there, and that'll be your time, right? Student loans, car, all that kind of stuff. Talk a little bit about why this is a fallacy and how we should think about this as we're going through our training. So when we get to that quote unquote light at the end of the tunnel, you're not disappointed.
Yeah. So, yeah, definitely one of my favorite concepts. And just to give recognition, so Tal Ben Shahar, Harvard trained psychologist, is the person that came up with this term. But I know very few fields where this term applies more, just accurately than medicine, right? So the idea is that we as humans have this concept that hey, when I crest this mountain or achieve this accomplishment or this accolade, at that point, this goal that I've been working toward, when I finally get there, that is when I'm going to be happy. And as Gertrude Stein said, right, like there's no there, right? And so because of that, what ends up happening is we work, get to this goal, and then we find out like, man, like this light at the end of the tunnel wasn't as bright as I thought it'd be. And the reason that matters so much in medicine is because it happens multiple times to us, right? So like you finish undergrad and you're like, okay, when I get to medical school, like, I passed my MCAT and I accomplished this, like that's when I'm going to really feel like I'm starting to, really accomplish my goals. You finish medical school as like the low person on the totem pole. And I don't know about other schools, but like we totally had like the short white coat, like where it's like evident I am not a physician, but I'm up here. I don't have a ton of experience. So like, hey, when I get that long white coat, maybe that's when I'm going to be like, yeah, this is starting to be worth it. And then you get to residency and fellowship and you're just like burning out at both ends, working 80 hours a week. And again, you're like, hey, when I become an attending physician, I'm making attending physician money. And, I finally arrived. That is when I'm going to be happy. And so you've delayed that arrival with those expectations every 4 or 5 years that it's going to get better. And unfortunately, when you become an attending physician and you start getting saddled with a whole bunch of different, let's just say expectations and, different experiences, it really becomes challenging because for most doctors, they get to the end of the road and they're like, wow, I'm not as happy as I thought I'd be. And so now they think they're broken, right? They're like, something's wrong with me. I'm dissatisfied in my career. It's a respected profession. I'm well paid. You might not be fairly paid. Those are different things, by the way, but well paid, by most standards, the vast majority of standards, right? You're making multiple six figures. And so, people start asking like these existential crisis questions, like, did I make a mistake? Like, what is my purpose in life? Is this really it? And am I going to do this for the next 30 years, knowing that 50% of doctors are burned out and we have the highest rate of suicide of any profession? It becomes really challenging because we thought when we arrived, it would get better. And for many doctors, it doesn't. And the end result of that is they start saying, hey, maybe I need to change jobs. Maybe I need to make a career transition. Maybe I need to do something different. And the reason they do that is because they're setting up another rival, right? When I get to that space, that is when I'm going to be happy. And it's not the way life works. And so while you're in training, that might sound depressing, by the way, I recognize that. But at the same time, like we have to learn how to enjoy our life where we are, enjoy the process. It's not about the destination. It's about the journey. And I'd be lying if I said that like, I had it all figured out when I finished, because the reason I learned about this fallacy is because I experienced it myself and I went through burnout myself. But the process is what we need to learn to enjoy, not the end product. Right. And so it does take time. It does take effort. It does take, lots of insight and conversations with, people that you respect to kind of help you sort that out.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it won't get better. You have to make it better, right? And you mentioned, having all that attending money, all the attending, the positives, but you also have attending problems, right? Yep. Expectations. You put it very nicely. And it depends on the type of medicine you're in, and there are different challenges with academic versus private practice. We've talked a lot about physician burnout. That conversation, particularly after the pandemic, has just really, in terms of the volume, has increased. And so the other thing is, over the last couple of years, with the advent of social media, internet, right? You've done a lot of coaching courses. People have had opportunities. Now I see trainees, medical students, they're really connected. In fact, actually, one of your anesthesia colleagues, I think, Dr. Aloti Patel, I think her name is on, she's Instagram, and she talked about how to be responsible in social media. In anesthesia, she used the ABCD, excuse me, advocacy, branding, communication, and then education, right, to DE. And I thought that was super awesome how to responsibly use that. And that creates opportunities that opens up a lot of doors for you. The problem with that becomes, right, we're heading from this physician burnout to entrepreneur burnout, something you've talked about before. And I think we're both millennials, yeah? Right?
Yeah, I'm like right on that cusp. I'm like
You're
a
on the cusp.
zennial.
Okay.
1985.
But you know Dwayne The Rock Johnson, right?
Oh,
and so I
sure.
think about this quote from The Rock, and maybe a long time ago, I saw on Instagram somewhere, and it's something to the tune of, if you're working 9 to 5 and then you go home and you're not grinding more on your own craft or something you're passionate about, and you're not working on the weekends, it's not that you don't have time, you're uninspired. Like, holy man, come on. And then you grow up, right, as a millennial in this age, and it's all about hustlers' ambition, hustlers' mindset, and you got to grind. And it's a little bit different because, one could say, well, how are you not a hustler? You're in medicine going through residency. Well, I think when people are quote unquote hustling, they're doing something outside the norm. They're doing extra. And in medicine, it's demanding, but it's all laid out for you. That's the norm. 80-hour weeks, if you're following rules and stuff like that's laid out for you. So it's got to be on top of that. And now we got all these opportunities. And so I guess my question for you is, as you impart wisdom onto your trainees, and you work with fellows, right?
So I work with residents and fellows, and actually med students too.
Yeah. So, but people who are going on to attending hood, and maybe even to me or to your younger self, how would you caution yourself not to fall in that trap?
This is always a really tough question for me to answer, because if I'm being honest, which, that's my MO, right? So, when I finished training, I was working 50 to 60 hours a week and 20 hours on my blog. Because back then it was just a blog. I was putting out 3 posts a week, every single week for like 2 years, right? So you can think about the amount of time that goes into maintaining a website, writing the posts, figuring out what you're going to write about, doing the research, all that stuff. And, I was very much in the midst of the hustle culture that you're alluding to. And there are really prominent people in this space. You mentioned Dwayne The Rock Johnson, but online entrepreneurs as well, that will tell you, like, if you don't hustle, like, you're never going to accomplish anything. And for me, exactly what you said earlier, I traded physician burnout for entrepreneur burnout. And so, like, looking back, like, what I tell myself, hey, don't do that, keep things simple. It's not worth it. It's tough, right? Because 90% of small businesses fail, and I was in the 10% that didn't. So, like, looking back for me, like, it's not a fair question in some ways, because it's like, if I knew I was going to succeed, like I have, would I do it again? 100%, right? Yep. But if I was in the other 90% of bloggers that, like, don't even exist from 7 years ago, putting in the same amount of work, like, would they go back and do it again? I don't know. Maybe they learned a lot of lessons and they'd say yes. Maybe they'd say no because they put the extra 20 hours. Yeah, and that's in addition to, like, just let's put this in context, because medicine, and one thing I'll say that I really try to bring to my trainees is a business experience, entrepreneurial experience, and just this idea that, like, medicine is the way that it is, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can be different. Like, there are other options out there that you don't know about because you're so just ingrained in the medical system, right? So we work 60 hours a week. Last time I checked, full-time's 40 for most professions. Right. And of those 60 hours a week, 20 of them are on charting, which is like, total soul sucking experience for many doctors. And then you're going to add another 20 hours a week. So now we're at 80. You're working 2 full-time jobs and expecting that somehow this is your salvation and you're not going to get burned out. And that's just not a realistic expectation. And so for me, as my business grew, I started learning, not only more about business and having more experience, but that, to be honest with you, simplicity is great. Right. And so there are other ways to get to some of your goals. Maybe it is working part-time like me. You can create side income. Great. That is one way. You can also save less money, right? And this is coming from a personal finance guy. You can make less money, right? So just because you finish and you graduate with a $300,000 salary doesn't mean you have to live on it, right? There are a lot of people in this country who live on a lot less than $300,000. But the second that you go through, the Diderot effect, where you have that sudden accumulation of wealth, and now all of a sudden, like, you feel like you need the new car, you need the new house, you need the private schooling for the kids, you adapt to a lifestyle that now, if you did cut back in terms of your spending, it would be extremely painful. And so I talk to my residents a lot about, when I finished training, looking for jobs, whether that was private practice or academics, the number one thing that I didn't know 7 years later that I would need in a job is flexibility. And so for me, going into a private practice, becoming a partner, where for most anesthesia practices, there's not a glide path or an opportunity to go part-time. I didn't know when I took my job that the most important thing that I needed wasn't even on my radar. And now looking back, I'm like, man, I really lucked into a great opportunity where like I've gone 5 days a week. I've gone 4 and then 2 and then 3, and I'm back at 2 now. Like I've changed so many times based on my family's needs, based on my business needs as things have gone up and down. And so I talk to my residents a lot about like the value of flexibility and the value of, who are you going to be 5 or 10 years from now? Because that person 5 or 10 years from now has very different needs fundamentally than who you are at the moment. Right. So if you don't have kids and you plan on having kids, I can promise you, having gone through this, I got 3 kids, 13, 10, and 7. I at this point, like the number one thing that I want to accomplish right now is being at all of my kids' stuff. And whatever I need to do to accomplish that is what I'm going to do, whether that means being 2 days in medicine or building side income or what have you. But just recognize there's a lot of different levers, and you got to get clear on who you are right now and who you're going to be.
Yeah, that's tough. I remember listening to one of your podcasts when you were talking about maybe your kid had asked you to put down the phone or something like that, and how that was dagger to your heart. What's crazy about listening to you is I was listening to another podcast called Happy Human, great podcast, one of the new ones, it's all about parenting. And I think these guys, there's an occupational therapist or a speech therapist, and then one's a psychologist who's working with the kids, and they said the same thing. They're trying to build a business, and what's challenging, my daughter is 2, and she says some things, but she can't explicitly say, "Hey, put down your phone." But I hear her all the time calling me, like say my name 7 times. What she doesn't understand is I'm not necessarily scrolling on social media. Maybe I'm responding to an email that's somewhat urgent, right? Or maybe I am responding to something to set up a podcast or communicating with my co-hosts and stuff, and building towards these goals, this ambition that I have. And frankly, she doesn't care, right? She just wants my attention. She just wants to be present. And I've been thinking a lot about that, but the challenge with that is, and Darsh, my partner, had a really good post about this recently. This whole concept, a lot of people, entrepreneurs, people who've quote unquote made it, will talk about the importance of saying no, and they'll go something like, when you say no, you're saying yes to something else. Or rather, when you say yes, you're saying no to something else, but you don't know what that is yet. I'm a firm believer in that. And I have been more mindful of that. Is when I'm saying yes, I'm like, it's not an absolute yes. Let me pause or get back to you later. And I think Darsh's post or a tweet recently was like, all these people who are talking about saying no, maybe 10, 20 years, they forget how many times they said yes earlier on in their career to be able to say no later on.
Sure.
How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I call it a hell yes policy. So the idea that, you say no to anything, it doesn't make you say hell yes. And it took time for me to get, pretty good at that. And part of the reason, and actually, let's be honest, one of the reasons that we struggled scheduling the show, right, is because I don't answer emails very frequently. I am very explicitly clear about when I will and won't do a podcast. And that is based on my family.
Yep.
And so, back in the day, I'd be like, "Oh yeah, you want to do a 9 p.m. podcast? Absolutely. Let's rock it out." Right. And now I'm like asleep at 9 p.m. because sleep's important and nutrition and health are important to me now. And so it is challenging because, again, being honest, looking back, I did say yes to a lot of things, but for me, that came from like just a baseline as a people pleaser. And so I had to do some recovering from that process and learn that like when I'm saying no to somebody, honestly, I'm not disappointing them. What I'm doing is being honest. And, my integrity being a huge part of who I try to be, that was an unacceptable kind of thing to do. But yeah, I said yes to a lot of things. And the huge pivot in my career was actually 2 years into my career as an academic physician. I was like fully engaged, all in, primary author on randomized control trials, winning the best teaching award as my first year as an attending. Like I was checking all the boxes, really good clinically. And so there were some leadership positions in my department that I really, wanted to be considered for. Let's just say there's political decisions being made in the background. And so despite doing everything I possibly could, saying yes to everything, it didn't pan out. And this isn't like a door closing. It's like the same door closing 4 times. And I talk about it in my book, Determined. But, for me, I learned very quickly that even when you say yes to things, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to end to the result that you want. And so, I'm not going to, at this point, waste my time on things that aren't very specifically going to get me to the goals that I I have in mind. But yeah, there is this idea that you got to say yes early. And I think that a lot of that comes from the fact that when you're a physician in training, like it's just expected of you to do what you're told and to do what
Mm-hmm.
you're asked. And it
Mm-hmm.
takes some time to realize like that's not true. Like that's not a fact. That is a thought. And believe it or not, when I learned to say no to people, people didn't get angry at me. Like it's not like they're pissed off. They're like, wow, I really respect that. Right. I'd have someone come be like, hey, can you teach me how to do social media? You got 12,000 followers and an email list with 10,000 people on it. Like, can you teach me how to do that? Like we're going to hold a session, a webinar for faculty who want to grow their social media reach. Could I do that? Yeah, I could. Am I going to do that? No, I'm not. Like that's just not on my priority list. And I found out that the more that I said no to people, actually, the more respect that I garnered. When I told people, hey, I don't check my work email for the hospital when I am not physically present on the premises. And I mentioned earlier, I work 2 days a week. So you can imagine some people send me emails and don't hear from me for 7 days. Right. And so they just know that. And they know that if they need to get in touch with me sooner, like my section head, my chair, everybody knows you're going to call Jimmy or text him because I've set those boundaries. And people are afraid to do that when they're young in their career, not recognizing that people don't get mad at that. They actually respect it. And the thought that goes through their head is, man, I wish I was like that. I wish I had the priorities that that person has to be very clear on what's important to them and what's not, and to set those boundaries like they do. And I found that interesting and I didn't know that when I started, right, as a young faculty member.
Yeah, I love this concept of setting boundaries, right? And because that's what you've done. I'm wondering, like, with that personality that you have of people pleasing earlier on. So if we rewind the clock, maybe 6 years, right?
Sure.
5, 6 years or so, when you're still early career attending, and you're saying yes to all these opportunities. And maybe people are reaching out because, again, email is big, right? And I think context and tone, all those things, body language, super important. So when maybe your residents or a colleague are communicating and you say, hey, listen, here's the situation, and you're communicating in person, they get it, they'll respect it. But have you found a way in email to politely communicate that? Did you have templates and stuff like that maybe I could borrow?
I definitely don't have templates. I try to respond to, as many emails as I can. And naturally, as that volume gets larger, it becomes more and more challenging. But, at this point, I'm just pretty direct about it.
Mm,
Someone says, hey, I'd like to help you with this. Like, I see that you got the social media presence and I want to help you grow that. Or like, hey, I saw you have a coaching business and we help coaches reach X, Y, and Z. Or, hey, I want you to come on my podcast. Or, hey, can I be a guest on yours? And, I just reply and say, hey, I'm not interested at this time. And it's just very matter of fact, very blunt. Like, I don't need to give you reasons.
yeah.
It's just the answer is no. And before, like, I used to feel like so bad about it. Be like, hey, like, we don't really have guests on the show. And so, because of that, we're not going to bring you on. And I'm sure that you're great. Like, I don't do any of that anymore. It's like, hey, I'm not interested. And some people are more persistent than others. And sometimes, persistence pays off. But for me, it like no is a complete sentence, right? And
Mm,
so like I don't have any reservations at this point of just saying that. And the reason why, like, let's talk about boundaries, because you mentioned boundaries. If there's an equation in life, right, like happiness is, let's say just expectations and reality, right? Those are the two things it has to do with. If you have high expectations and reality isn't quite meeting that goal, you're going to be dissatisfied. You're going to be unhappy. And so what we tell ourselves is that, like, hey, we're going to, manipulate reality such that, we're going to be happier because we're going to make reality better. And when you're dealing with two human beings, right, their expectations of how you're going to respond are completely independent of you. You can't impact that. Right. So if they have super high expectations, you could say yes and still not meet those expectations. They might still be disappointed in you, no matter how much work you put into it. So this idea that I'm going to say yes to somebody and make them happy isn't true. Or the idea that I'm going to say no and it's not going to make them happy also isn't true. Like, you can't dictate people's reactions to things, right? Well, what I can dictate is my expectations of how people will respond. Right. So if I say no and they get upset, that's on them. Right. Like, maybe they're having a bad day. I have no idea. But like, I'm not going to like set the expectation that if I say yes to people that I'm going to make them happy, because you can do everything right in life and relationships, whether that's marriage, children, colleagues at work, do everything in your power to do something right. And they could still end up being angry.
I love that. As you're talking about that, I'm thinking about, I think there's a sense of freedom that you have to be able to do that, right? To make those firm boundaries. I think a challenge that I think about a lot of, in again, in medicine, you mentioned, you don't feel like you have that, right?
Mhm.
There's the culture of medicine is like, okay, when you're told something, you got to do it. I even find myself falling this trap, if I'm being completely honest with you. Again, I tell people there's no type Bs in medicine. You're type A or A1 or A2, right? And so you have to be intrinsically motivated, and you just figure stuff out. And so sometimes when you're providing guidance to somebody, or maybe it's publishing or case report, whatever it might be, you say, hey, can you figure this out? And there are certain people who won't do it, and you have to be more like pestering them. And as attending, you're like, I can't believe this is happening. It's like, okay, well, if everything that I'm talking about here, everything we're talking about here is that we have to break this mindset of this antiquated mindset. It was like, because it was hard for me, or I had to go through all these challenging, therefore you should too. Like, I'm being pretty hypocritical right now if I'm not going to make it better. And so, that's the cognitive dissonance. It's so interesting that we've been talking about this for 3 years, right? We call medicine redefined. We want to make it a better way. Yet I
Sure.
find myself falling in that trap all the time. So that is so interesting to me.
I think it's an interesting thing, and I will, controversial comment or not, I think you're a bad human being if you want things to be worse or as bad as things were for you. Like,
Agreed.
can you think about that from like a parenting perspective, and like imagining a conversation with your kid where you're like, you know what, son, I want things to be as hard as they were for me or harder for you. And so I'm not going to help you in any way, shape, or form, even though I've got the
Yeah.
resources and the abilities to do that. Like, that makes you a bad parent. Now,
Mhm.
I'm not saying that like, you should enable your children. Like I'm like the most anti-enabler possible. Like my kid, if they have a problem, I'm like, go deal with it, go solve it. Right. I'm
Yeah.
not going to talk to the teacher for you. Go have a conversation with your teacher, sort it out, see how it goes, go have a conversation and learn how to be an adult. Right. That's the process of becoming an adult. And right, your parenting is responsible for that. And so for me, like, I don't enable my children. I don't solve my problems for them. But like this idea that like, I want it to be as bad or worse for you than it was for me. Like, I think that says more about the older person,
Mhm.
in their journey than it does about the younger generation. And there is a lot of generational conversations at this point, because what the generations, let's just say, behind me have figured out is like, I don't want to sacrifice being, a doctor and a partner and a parent, if that role is something that involves you. Like, I want to be good at all three of those things. Whereas the people ahead of my generation, I'm like right on the cusp of both of these conversations. My older generation, like there's a reason you're called a house officer, right? Like, that was your house. It's where you were expected to live.
Mhm.
And you have people from those generations, if you ask them, they'll be like, yeah, my kid was like, hey daddy, like, are you gonna, stay at the hospital? Or are you gonna, come where I am? And they're like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, you live at the hospital.
Mhm.
Right. And so like, being a physician and doing that was your identity. And so they've laid this expectation on younger generations that it'll be the same for us. And we're all saying like, no, we're going to buck the gourds. Like, there's no way in the world I'm going to, make this a priority over my children or my wife, right? Or your
Yeah.
partner, depending on your situation. Right. So like, it is an interesting conversation for sure.
That friend of mine that I was talking about with the disability insurance earlier, he's in private practice down in Texas, and he just two providers, and he was expecting it's getting a couple months, and he had told his boss when he was expecting, hey, this is happening in May, and his boss's response was like, well, you could be a good doctor or a good father. You can't be both.
Yep.
It's like, wow. All right. So if that's not like telling at that point, right? And so
Yeah.
it is very, very disappointing, but I think it's super helpful for us to have more of these conversations, particularly in academic medicine, right? I think because
Yeah.
we're directly working with trainees, and yeah, it's good in social media, but there's a lot of poison out there too. And so I think what's, these trainees and the next generation, our generation, are inspired to have this, but we don't know strategies and tactics, which we're going to get a little bit into later. No, sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead.
And I was going to say, I think this is a really important point, right? Because when you go through medicine, so much of what it does to you is it makes being a physician your identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you get to that arrival fallacy and you realize that that identity isn't what's going to make you happy in life, that's the issue. That's the existential crisis that people have. They're like, wait, hold on. I worked so hard to get to this point professionally. This is the point at which I'm supposed to be happy. And it turns out that your satisfaction and fulfillment and happiness in life often don't come from medicine. Right. And so when people ask me like, who I am, right, I'm a God-fearing husband, father. And honestly, at this point, I'd probably put entrepreneur before physician. And people are like, I mean, sacrilege, like screaming at the top, like, you must be a terrible doctor because you have all these other priorities ahead of you. And I'm like, if I took care of you clinically, I can promise you, you would feel like you're my number one priority when I'm at work, because you are. Right. And I would take fantastic care of you because I can. It doesn't make me a bad doctor that I've recognized that it's not in the top 3 or 4 things on my priority list at this point. But when you get done, the identity of being a physician is so strong amongst doctors that learning like that's the existential twist, right? Is exactly what your colleague was told, right? Like you can be a good father or you can be a good doctor, and the reason why is because it goes back to that hell yes policy we talked about before. You can't say yes to both things. And one of my favorite quotes on this is Greg McKeown. He wrote the book Essentialism, and he basically points out that like the word priority originally meant like the one thing above all others. And then at some point in the English language, 100 years later, we decided to make that word plural and pretend that like there can be multiple things that are above all others. And that's just not the way that it works. And so if you're being honest, there is a priority list. And, I wouldn't go as far as to say like you can be a good dad or a good doctor, but I will say that you are going to focus on one of those more than the other. And you're going to recognize that when you say yes to being, quote unquote, a good doctor and doing the committees and the research and all this other stuff, you're really saying no to your kid. And eventually the rubber's going to meet the road. And I'm not telling you what to do. Like for some people, like professional fulfillment may be more important to them than being a parent. And you got to be honest about that, right? And that's really ugly to say on a public podcast. But if some people are honest, it's more important to them than being a parent, right? And for a lot of the others of us, we're like, no, I'm be honest with that. When I have to choose, I'm going to my kid's baseball practice. Like it's not even at this point a decision. It's just I've set the priority, right? But it's a lie if you think that you can prioritize multiple things as the number one thing in your life, right?
Yeah, particularly with competing demands, right? I think about Chip and Dan Heath. They wrote this really good book about decision making. And I think the very final chapter in it talks about enshrining your core priorities. Like you're putting it on the mantle up there. Like what is the most important thing to you? Yep. At that point, I was like, okay, listen, it has to be family. And then you look back and you're like, okay, well, but do my actions reflect what I'm saying?
100%.
Right. And I had to go through quite a bit of therapy to realize, okay, how do I step away? And the other thing is, you talk about patients or even your colleagues who are like, whoa, you're going through like what? So you did 6 years of training on top, right? So you did, or 5 years. Yeah, you did 5 years, right? Yeah. So 9 years of training and whatever student debt and all that kind of stuff. And, it's a disservice to humanity, especially with, doctors are a shortage, everything that happened. And it's like, okay, how are you not going to prioritize that in that service industry? Well, I think it also goes back to another thing we were talking about with family, being present. So when you're there, you're a doctor in front of your patients, you're in that room, right? We're having these conversations. You're not thinking about the charting. You're not thinking about the billing on the prior patient or the procedure that's coming up. You are there. You're present. Right. You're letting that human being know that this connection right there, this is what it's all about. And this is what matters now. And that is so hard because the other thing is like, we think about productivity, sexy word, right? Yep. And the concept is, okay, the more you can do, the more tasks you can juggle, the more productive you are. Well, Cal Newport just came out with a new book, or it's coming out, Slow Productivity. Big fan of him. And I was listening to him on Adam Grant's podcast this morning, talking about what slow productivity means. And, he has 3 principles on it, right? You do fewer things, not more things. You do fewer things. You do them. I forget what the second one is, but the third one is just the most important one is you obsess over the quality of the work. Right. And I think that's another important thing is like, as we take things off that priority list, which might be 10 things, you can focus in, hone in, be present in your connections, family, patient interactions, and the quality of all those interactions, the quality of what you end up producing, putting out in the world is just going to rise. And that'll open up more doors for you, which you eventually have to say no to unless it's a hell yes. So that's another oxymoron that you think about. And I think we don't talk about that enough.
Yeah, no, I agree. And entrepreneurs, like for those that are listening to this, like you really need to hear that. And so for me, the lie that I kept listening to early on is that you have to scale, right? Like you got to help more people. It's got to scale. You got to make recurring revenue and all this other stuff. And when it really came down to it, like I just like helping people, right? And so like at this point, like we do coaching, we do disability insurance, and we do student loans, and all of those are very, like for the most part, non-scalable. Just simple things. And so like when you talk about slow productivity, for me, it was getting away from this idea that the rest of the world tells you like, you got to scale and making things simpler and slowing down and focusing on financial literacy. Like I give away a ton of financial literacy content for free. And you know why? I'm be honest, because I like it. I enjoy it. I'm slowly productive. I create videos. I edit them myself. I write the blog post, do the podcast, all that sort of stuff. And I think that is something that a lot of people miss in that hustle culture. And I will say that, for entrepreneurs listening, that third point that you pointed out by Newport is kind of a tough pill to swallow, because at some point you got to be okay with B plus work. If you obsess over perfectionism, which every single doctor that I know is, you will just never get started when it comes to entrepreneurship. That is the biggest hurdle. Like, oh, well, I got to learn everything about podcasting, the exact equipment, and like exactly how I'm supposed to edit and do all this stuff. And it's like, no. Just get behind a microphone, start talking into it. You're going to be terrible. That's okay. You're going to learn from it. And your first 47 episodes are not going to be good. It's not 47. It's more like 10. But all that said, like, you learn by doing, and medicine's no different. You did the same thing in medicine. But this idea behind perfectionism and like an obsession on quality, like I think that would be, in the entrepreneurial space, challenging. But I do love Newport's, deep work, and like, seems like that's an extension of his other idea. So I look forward to reading that one.
Yeah. I wonder if, and if he helps make the distinction between, and I got to pick up the book, between perfectionism, because I couldn't agree more. And this is where, shout out to Darsh, who's so good at this, right? And this is one of the reasons I partnered up with him, because I think I bring a slightly different dynamic to this, and where I am the crazy researcher, and I will go do a deep dive of what's the most optimal mic that's going to be done this and that, and he's just like, I'm going to pick up a mic from Amazon for $40 because that's what I can afford right now. We're just going to record.
Yep.
Okay, great. And so, I couldn't agree with more, because I think that, again, I am prone to paralysis by analysis, and a lot of people like that are. And so, couldn't agree more with that. Let's shift a little bit, talking specifically about academic medicine. We've touched on the importance of training the next generation, and how even it helps us grow. And not too long ago, or maybe it was like last year at some point, you had tweeted about becoming associate professor. Congrats, by the way.
Thanks.
And how your academic promotion journey stops there. And I'm curious why.
Yeah, so this goes back to the hell yes list. For me, like, I've slayed that dragon. Like, I know I can publish, RCTs and be a, PI or a, more senior author. I know that I can teach. I know that I can work clinically. And for me, it's a question of like, hey, I've got 24 hours in the day, like every other human. And I do like that quote, like the first half of that quote by, The Rock, like you only have so much time. And so what I would say is, like, you're not prioritizing things. If you use this phrase, like, I don't have the time, like, people say that all the time. It's like, that's not true. That is 1000% never true. You just aren't prioritizing things. Right. And so for me, like, it's a low priority at this point. Like, I'm not doing research. Like, all of the additional hurdles that have been put in place, like, it's not just like clinical medicine where, like, oh, it's now like peer reviews and all this charting, like, boxes you have to check in order to bill somebody, and, just keeps becoming, more and more complicated and challenging. They did the same thing with research, right? It's like all of the information you have to put on clinicaltrials.gov now, like, it's stupid. And the vast, majority of the work to go into research to answer a question that you may be passionate about, for me, just wasn't worth it anymore. I was like, I'm not putting in all this time, right, to potentially make a non-clinical incentive 3 years later. That's definitely not worth the amount of time that I put into it, when I can help doctors with other things. And if I'm being honest, I'm more passionate about. And so I just know that in order to get, like, for associate professor at Wake, you have to get to about 12 or 13 like solid publications, in addition to educational and clinical, whatever you want to call it, clout. And so to get to full professor, I want to say it's 25 or 30 publications. And like, at this point, like, there is next to zero chance, unless I'm just like a co-author on a bunch of papers for my colleagues, which I enjoy helping other people do their stuff, but I just don't want to do it myself. Right. And so for me, like, I just can't imagine getting to a full professorship where I'm not the PI or senior author on papers anymore. And that's just not something I'm going to prioritize. Maybe when my kids are grown and I've got nothing else to do, like, okay, maybe 20 years from now.
Yeah. But it's so clear from the work that you put out there that they're just not passionate about that aspect of it. Right. I mean, you don't talk about that type of stuff, but you know what, man, you were right. It is stupid, because all the things that you are doing, the financial education that you're providing, the coaching courses that you've had, the book that you've written, that is exponentially more important in making somebody a good quality physician, right? A well-rounded physician as well. Like, and I'm just wondering, do you see a future 10, 15 years from now, hopefully you'll still be practicing in academic medicine, where we prioritize those things that will allow you to kind of escalate the ranks, as opposed to the research publications, which are completely irrelevant. And we also know there are a lot of ways to work. First of all, like good quality research and putting in reputable journals, hard work, agreed. But there's predatory journals all the time. You pay $150 or $200 and you get it published, right? Or you just become a PI and make your trainees do all the work, which is bad practice. But people have workarounds on that, and it's completely irrelevant. Do you see that?
Yeah. So to answer your first question about, do I see a world in which this stuff is taught? The answer is yes. And it's been interesting because like being at the tip of the spear in academics, because like when I think about the physician finance space, to be honest with you, I think I may be the only academic physician in that space. I'm not certain of that. But certainly among the, more well-known personal finance, blogs, podcasts, that sort of thing. And so when I started, I offered a personal finance curriculum to residents, to the SRNA students, because, I do anesthesia and I think every medical professional deserves to be financially literate, to the PA students. I cannot tell you the number of times people said no. And this was like completely free financial literacy. I'm happy to help, your students learn how to do this. And as the data and the research came out that like financial stress is one of the most stressful aspects of being a physician. Oh, and by the way, financial stress is linked to burnout. Oh, and by the way, like all of this stuff. And like, it just makes sense, right? Like when you're burning out in medicine and you hate your life and you hate your job, the only reason that you stay in it is because you cannot financially afford to leave and pay off $300,000 in student loans or to continue to pay for the lifestyle that you've created. The only thing keeping those people in that situation is finance. That's it. And so like just logically, philosophically, it makes sense. The literature is now bearing this out. And so I think not only will this stuff be taught, I think the ACGME, unless they've just got their head in the sand, will absolutely mandate that these topics get taught in residency, because financial aid offices exist in medical school. But then when you actually have to implement a plan in residency, they are not required by the GME, which is insane to me. And in fact, I've offered services for that at institutions, and some people are like, yeah, I'm willing to pay. And some people are like, no, the GME's poor. We can't do that. And it's like, again, the lie, the 24-hour lie. Like, you're not poor. You're just prioritizing money in other locations. But I think at some point the ACGME will mandate this, because they'll have to reckon with the fact that physician burnout exists. It's related to financial stress. Financial stress has been shown to be related to low financial literacy and higher student loan burdens, which continue to increase. And at some point you just have to say, like, if we're doing the right thing by people, this stuff has to be taught in training. Like not like it should be taught. At some point it has to be taught.
Couldn't agree more. And hopefully, ACGME has made wellness a real point of, medical education over the last couple of years. And this is part of that. I think about my own financial education journey, and it was all because of my student loans. I am just shy of $400,000 in debt.
Yep.
And at the time I was like, it was my greatest source of anxiety. No kids, no marriage at that point. Greatest source of anxiety coming out. And I just remember that time. So I graduated in May, fourth year, 2017. And I just stumbled upon White Coat Investor. And I went down this rabbit hole, Ben White, this, all that kind of stuff. And then I realized, I was like, oh man, I got to file my taxes this year, right? And so I can get that first year $0 payments and stuff. That's thousands of dollars on the back end, right? That people don't think about. It's the simplest strategy. It didn't have any income that year. And so just simple things of that nature, right? I mean, we talk about people who are still investing in whole life insurance, right? Because that's going to be good policy. And it's sickening that people are 20 years in. And as you mentioned, right, you are well paid. You make multiples millions of dollars. There's no reason you shouldn't be able to have your financial situation figured out. It's just the literacy piece of it. I mean, Jim Dolly posts on White Coat Investor, like I think recently he's been doing just the burnout rates in different professions and student loans and this and that. And it's crazy. But again, these types of conversations, platforms such as yours and a lot of other folks in the space, I think do help. And we just have to kind of promote it. But yeah, academic medicine sometimes isn't a silo. So I'm a little shocked, to be honest, that people wouldn't take you up on stuff like that. But I think it just goes back to like, what medicine has prioritized is like, okay, that's not important. Learning renal tubular acidosis is far more important because you're going to use that, at some point.
There's an inherent challenge here, right? That has to be recognized. So I'll give an example of my own institution, right? So having these conversations internally, I have a business that's external to the institution, but I'm an internal faculty member. And so I certainly can't take an hour or 2 hours on every student loan consult and provide that for free to the residents and fellows at Wake, right? So that time has to be paid for from somewhere, whether that's the GME office or, we charge the residents and fellows a like ridiculously low price so they can get student loan consults that don't cost $600. Cause I think that, when you're in training, I couldn't have afforded a $600 student loan consult when I was in training. And so, how do we make this affordable for residents when they really need the help? And for me, it's like, I need the money from one place to the other. And really it's not money, because money is a surrogate always for time, right? I need the time to be able to do these things. And so it brings in conflict of interest conversations, right? Which are really challenging. And I totally get it from like the institution's perspective. But yeah, it's, how do you sort that out, right? Because the people that have the knowledge aren't going to be doing this for free, right? Because by nature, they are entrepreneurs, right? And the people that are inside the hospital that may want to help typically don't have the knowledge. The vast majority of physicians are financially illiterate. So like, who's going to teach these people, right? And yet we pay for consultants to come in all the time to hospitals to help us figure out really expensive problems that, they just give like their generic blanket statements of like ways to improve X, Y, and Z. The hospital pays millions of dollars people come in, and instead of just asking like the people that are internal to the institution, like, hey, what's going on? Right. And so like, it's not that the money's not there. It's not that we don't use consultants in other areas of life, but when your consultant works at the hospital for you, it's just a different flavor of conversation. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's
I get
really
it.
tough.
I totally get it.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't really know the workaround with that. Cause I think about that all the time. Right. And so because you are a mentor and stuff, so a lot of times we end up doing these things for free. Right. And you're not getting paid for your time.
Well, people are going to ask anyway. Like, even if I don't have a formal curriculum, people know who I am.
Yeah.
So like, hey, Jimmy, I've got a question about, student loans.
Quick curbside.
Yeah, exactly. So there is not a day at this point that I go to work where someone doesn't ask me about personal finance. It doesn't happen.
So tell me this then. That happens, your APD or program director fellowship?
So I was the program director fellowship, actually stepped down in July, handed it off to my buddy, but I did that for a few years. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So you feel a sense of responsibility to your trainees and stuff, right? Because you are, again, you use the analogy of being a parent and not passing it on. It's quite not the same relationship, but you do feel a sense of responsibility that, hey, I'm responsible for their education. I got to put good physicians out in the world, or at least be a positive along their training. And if people come and stop you and ask you about that stuff, you know how important this is, maybe even more important than the other procedure that you might have taught them how to do.
Sure.
Reconciling that with the fact that I think you've mentioned at some point that you would tell people, can this conversation happen in 5 minutes or 60 seconds or so, if not email me or something like that? How do you handle that?
No, so for me, because I like helping people so much, anytime a resident, student, colleague stops me at the hospital, like, I'll take as long as I need to have that conversation, because I recognize that the resources aren't out there for that maybe they don't that they trust to help them with their need. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I love simplicity, right? So I love helping people one-on-one. I love making that connection. I love providing help to people. Like, is that going to make a business like go to the moon and scale? Like, the answer is absolutely fundamentally no. The comment when I tell somebody, and I remember reading, like, what is it? The 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss, when he's talking about like being in the office and like just having headphones on your ears, even though they're not like listening to anything, just so that people don't bother you. And so for me, when I make comments like, hey, I've got 3 minutes till this meeting, and looking at my watch, given the social cue, it is typically around those things that I say no to.
Yeah.
Right. So like, will I let you curbside me on, something that isn't a priority to me? Like, yeah, I'll give you 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. But if it's not something I'm passionate about, if it's not something that is in my wheelhouse, I'd much rather refer you to someone else, and or just tell you like, look, I do not currently have the time for this. So one-on-one for like the financial stuff, like, I can't tell you the number of times I'm like on second shift and have a resident saying, hey, I don't know what student loan program to enroll in. I like, where do I even start? And just start asking them questions about their situation and giving them general ideas. I have to crunch the numbers to tell them for sure. But yeah, happy to take time to do that stuff.
You know what's funny? I'm thinking about maybe I got this from Ryan at one point. He was just talking about enough people were asking him these questions, or maybe it was a different podcast, where when he started the podcast, he would just send the podcast to somebody. It's like, hey, listen to this. This will answer all your questions and
I
stuff.
do the same thing.
Yeah. Does that work for you? Because it doesn't work for me. Uh, 'cause- and I'm wondering why. Like, for instance, recently I've had a couple of friends who were asking me about job contracts and negotiations and like that kind of stuff. What's important? And we had John Apino from Contract Diagnostics come on here, and we did 2 episodes on him, and we covered a lot of that stuff. And they're not long ones either, right? So it's less than 2 hours of total content. And I'll be like, hey, listen to this. This will literally answer every question and more. Give you thoughts to think about. And then I still hear about or questions, but like, well, what about this? I'm like, you didn't listen at all. I know you didn't listen.
Yeah. So my experience in education is interesting, right? So like I will have 80% of the medical school class. I do a 4th year curriculum for the personal finance. So like they actually pay for 10% of my FTE to do that.
Nice.
And so, take time, love helping the students, but man, you'll have 90, 100 students sign up and then like 24 of them will show up live.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just my experience over and over and over again. Like people want this stuff. But really what they want, and you can, I mean, this makes sense, right? They're busy physicians. So like, tell me what to do. Right. So like I can go and educate myself, but 80% of the doctors out there are going to be like, I mean, I could go listen to your podcast, but you could also just tell me what to do. Right. And so like simplifying things and being like, look, you're a resident, you need 3 things, right? You need a student loan plan, you need own occupation disability insurance. We can add term life insurance if you have people dependent on your income. And you need to be financially literate. That's like the extent of your knowledge and like the tasks that you have while you're in residency. Like there's your to-do list, right? Go get a student loan plan, go get an occupation disability insurance, and get some sort of financial literacy, however you want to consume that. Sometimes the answer is that people don't have time. Sometimes it's, hey, I really appreciate the podcast, but I'm a book person. I'm a blog person. Actually, I like watching videos on YouTube. So people consume content in different ways, right? If I'm a car guy, if I want to go learn about cars, I'm going to Throttle House on YouTube. It's my favorite channel. I'm going to watch like every video that they put out. It's like 3 million subscribers at this point. I was following them back before they were like below 1 million. And, but like if I want to learn about personal finance, to be honest with you, I'm going to probably go read a book. But if I want to learn about like, self-improvement, or if I want to learn about, maybe like more, let's just say like philosophical ideas around money, or, some of the ideas that we've talked about today, like Cal Newport, I'll probably buy the Audible version of that book and listen to it in my car. Right. So everyone consumes content differently. Some people don't want to have the education. They just want the list of like, hey, here's the things to do. And so I definitely run across that. But at the same time, you send me an email and I've got content that's specifically created behind answering that question. I'm going to send that to you. And if you don't want to read it, that's on you, And again, it's like, I'm trying to help you, but like, I can't meet one-on-one with everybody for 30 minutes. Like that's not possible.
Yeah. And, hopefully all of my trainees are going to be listening to this, and my mentees, certainly I'm going to send them this. And I think that here's a little thing that's important for them to know. I mean, just like you thrive in rotations, and when you're trying to get a letter from somebody, you have a conversation, you go back, you read a little bit more about it, and you come back and you discuss with the attending, right? Because that gap between medical school or medical 30 or 4th year medical student and attending, oh my, it's astronomical. People don't appreciate that, right? Even though it might be 6 years, but it's astronomical. But if you go learn about a concept, or at least just introduce yourself, and then you can have a deeper conversation, attendings and really, or somebody who's an expert in a matter, subject matter expert, can within moments tell who's interested, who's not interested. And so I couldn't agree with more. Recently, when people ask me questions like, well, what do you think about supplementation? Or what do you think about intermittent fasting? Or what do you think about this type of stuff? Well, I'll say, okay, well, how do you like to learn, right? Is it YouTube? Is it this? Because I can literally, is it a blog? We're going to Physician Philosopher, WCI, that kind of stuff. You're right. Is it a podcast? This is a student loan planner. They have a good stuff, books, and they'll do that. And then you come back, we can have deeper conversations. And I am more likely to give you that extra time that if I know you're not interested in, and we can't learn from each other and we can't have deep conversations, that's just, we're both wasting our time. Let's find another way to connect with somebody else.
Yeah. I've heard somebody say before that, when it comes to like a mentor-mentee relationship, that is driven by the mentee. And in my experience, that's true, because man, I can, as you're experiencing on the show, talk about things for forever. And I love doing that. But if you're not engaged or interested or willing to implement the things that we're talking about, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. So like, I much prefer the situation where a resident comes up to me and says, hey, Jimmy, I've got this question, than to, just sit people down on like a rotation and be like, hey, we're going to talk about personal finance now. Because like for the, people that aren't interested in it, it's something that it's just not going to be super meaningful to them. Maybe I expose them. Maybe there's some like seed that I plant that like comes to fruition 7 years later. Like I've got no idea. But for me, when like it's driven by the mentee and they're interested, it's such a more engaging conversation. It's something that they actually do and apply. And so, for me, that's been my experience, people reaching out and being proactive. And then it's up to them how much they want to follow through on something.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Earlier, you mentioned that you didn't appreciate how flexibility would be the most important factor for you when you were looking at medicine. And I think, we always talk about hindsight being 2020. And again, residents, fellows looking for their next job, first job, whatever it might be, even medical students, when they think about 5 years from now, how they'd like to practice. I think foresight it's a superpower, right? Having that, but it's what's called foresight. And that's why nobody says foresight's 2020. How do you have conversations with your trainees so they can strengthen that foresight, so they can make important decisions along the way, so they avoid all these pitfalls like the arrival fallacy, early burnout, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a tough question, just because like breaking it down in different areas of your career, like a fourth year med student asking like, hey, which residency do I choose? Like I'm trying to think about a specialty. Like I've got a whole, framework of thinking around that versus a resident choosing a practice, whether that's private practice or academics, what have you. It's challenging. I think when people are choosing between choice A and choice B, like let's say that's the situation, you're choosing between two different jobs. I think pro con lists are absolutely worthless. And that's kind of the common way that people go about thinking about that. I think a much more helpful exercise that I go through clients, coaching is what is the worst case scenario, right? You've got option A. What is the worst case scenario in that situation? And then option B, same thing. And if you can tolerate either of those, or I should say both of those situations, then just choose whichever one makes your heart happy, right? But if you're like looking at option B and you're like, man, like if we move there and it's away from family, the income's not great, we'd have to buy a house and the market's terrible right now. And we'd have to, come up with 8% to sell the house, plus have an emergency fund. Like I cannot, oh, and by the way, the malpractice, I'd have to pay for the tail. Like I would not be able to financially afford to leave this job if I chose that job. There's no fallback plan. And then option A is like, well, I can just come back and practice where I am right now. That's not terrible, right? You're going to choose option A, right? Choose the one that has, a worst case scenario that you can handle. And so when you're thinking about foresight, it isn't 2020. You're not going to know everything. And so, thinking forward, you're like, well, I don't have a family yet, but I plan on having a family. What would be important to me then? And thinking about what is the worst case scenario if I have 1, 2, 3 kids and I'm at this job? Like, what would my option be if I wanted to cut back? And if there isn't an option, maybe you don't consider that job. Maybe you're like, hey, instead of taking a partner track, what if I take an employee track? I'm going to make less money, but I'm not working nights. I'm not working weekends. I'm not working holidays. There's no 24-hour call. Maybe I can cut back. Are there employed physicians in this group that do that? They're working 4 days a week instead of 5. And you're going to start figuring out like, oh, this is something that potentially my future version of myself wants. And worst case scenario, I could always do X, Y, and Z. Right. And so hindsight's 2020, foresight is not. And so I think understanding like, hey, what would my options be in the situation based on where I'm planning on going, knowing that I'm strong enough, I'm smart enough, capable enough to pivot if I need to.
I love that. I love it. What does it mean to be the self-determined physician?
Oh man. Listen, I wrote an entire book about this. So yeah, when you think about, Edward D.C., Richard Ryan came up with this term self-determination and the research on basically intrinsic engagement. You can think about like the self-determined physician is someone who's engaged. They love what they do. They're fulfilled. And in order to do that, you need 3 things, which are broken up into, I guess, 5 buckets, right? So autonomy, belonging, and competence. So I call them the ABCs of self-determined physicians. So the A is autonomy. It's kind of broken into a couple of things. So you need personal autonomy. So when I talk about making my kids 7 p.m. baseball practice tonight, like I'm going to be there and that makes me happy, right? Hasn't played baseball since like, T-ball, like all of a sudden took a love for it, actually has a really decent arm. So I'm excited to see him pitch and bat, and baseball was my favorite sport growing up. Like wouldn't miss it for the world. But if I was on call tonight, I would, right? So having the personal autonomy over my schedule is really important. There's also professional autonomy, right? So that's the second of the 5 buckets. And what that means is like you get to practice how you want, right? So like when you start thinking about people and they're complaining about, having to have peer-to-peer reviews where their quote unquote peer is not a peer, or having to do, like go through insurance to get pre-approval for something, like that's impacting your professional autonomy. It's why it upsets people so much. Similarly, being able to practice the way that you want, which may be dictated by policies and procedures at your hospital or clinic, wherever you work. The B is belonging. So this is the idea that like you feel valued. You're not a cog in the wheel. You're not a number on a spreadsheet. Like you are a valued member of the team who's accomplishing a deeper purpose, which is the second piece of that, right? So we got personal autonomy, professional autonomy, a sense of being a valued team member who's for accomplishing a deeper purpose. That one's interesting because most doctors do. Like, I mean, I am taking care of patients. Like normally that one checks off the list. The fifth one is competence. So being good at what you do, and more importantly, feeling like you're good at what you do, which brings in the whole conversation of imposter syndrome and people actually being good at what they do, but feeling like they're terrible and judging themselves for perceived mistakes. And so when you have that autonomy, the personal and professional autonomy, you feel like you're valued and that you're accomplishing a deeper purpose. In other words, that you belong and you feel good at your job. When you have all 5 of those things, you are a self-determined physician and you are someone that is engaged, love what you do, feel fulfilled at work. And when you have all 5 of those pieces, that is the person that reads my Twitter posts about the arrival fallacy and thinks that I'm like just full of it, right? Because like I finished and I love what I do. Well, guess what? You have all 5 of those things. But for the other 80% of physicians that don't, that is why they're unhappy. They're missing the personal autonomy. They don't feel valued by the healthcare system, right? They've got peer-to-peer conversations that are impacting their professional autonomy. Maybe they're going through massive imposter syndrome. They don't feel good at their job. When you're missing one of these 5 things, that is called burnout, right? It is the antithesis of this, right? So talk about the emotional exhaustion and the lack of perceived accomplishment, like the 3 pillars that Freudenberg originally described on burnout. They are the exact opposite of having the ABCs of being a self-determined physician.
Well, thank you for that, man. I know you spoke about this a lot in your book, but I want to introduce people to that because I think when people think self-determined, they're like, well, of course I'm self-determined. I'm in medicine. I went through all the steps. I checked all the boxes. I jumped all the hurdles and I got where I am. How could I be if I'm not determined? In fact, my group of friends from college, like that's how they would describe me. They would say disciplined, determined, and this and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, it's actually, it's just, you just gotta, the steps are all laid out for you, but everything that you've talked about here and elsewhere, it's like, these are not steps that are laid out for you, which is why I think it's important for us to have these conversations for your coaching and for us to implement into medical education and GME. Jimmy, I appreciate everything you do, man. Thank you so much for being here. If I've learned anything, I want to respect your time. I'm not going to take too much of it. And, hopefully if you enjoyed it, then maybe we'll find another time to talk about this because we can do this all day. Right. So,
sure.
Tell people where they can connect with you. You're on Twitter, you're a couple socials, you're got a coaching practice, a couple podcasts. How do they connect with you? What's the best way?
Yeah, the best current way is to go to moneymeetsmedicine.com. You can also check out the podcast, Money Meets Medicine, as well. And so actually, if people want, because this is like the year of financial literacy for me, like I'm trying to give away everything because I want people to know what they need to know. They can actually go to moneymeetsmedicine.com/redefined and get a free copy of my book, The Physician Philosopher's Guide to Personal Finance. So it's in an ebook and a PDF format, so you can download it to your Kindle if you like to consume it that way. And by all means, share it with all your friends, family, other medical professionals.
Love it, man. Thank you for doing that. Last but not least, this is kind of the theme of the show, right? So the question that we like to ask people, we say that we practice in a sick care system. Burnout, large contributor to that for physicians. And so the question for you is, we're aiming to put the health back in healthcare. Mm-hmm. How do you think we do that?
Man, complicated. So right now, I think that we have a system that is profit over people. Right. So you hear administrators say stupid things like no margin, no mission, which on the face of it makes sense. Like you're like, well, if the hospital doesn't make money, it's a business and therefore we'd have to quote unquote, shut off the lights. And you're like, right. But that's short-sighted. The way that you get a margin is by helping your physicians and medical professionals become self-determined. And then it's amazing what people can do when they're intrinsically motivated and engaged and how much money your hospital will make when people love working with you. They feel like they have autonomy and they feel like they're good at their job, right? So if you want to make margin, you have to put people over profit. And, specific ways to do that are a little more challenging to answer because it's going to be individualized to different institutions and, let's just say companies, because that's what medicine is nowadays. But, I think ultimately from a philosophical standpoint, that's what's going to have to happen.
Love it. Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on.